Right. Good morning, everyone, and good morning, our audience. My name is Energy2023. I'm the moderator and host for this session today, which is about non-executive directors and their responsibilities and expectations in connection with the challenges that we have regarding the energy transition, risk management, and many other topics that are of interest, not just for NEDs, but for anyone facing these challenges. And I have a very distinguished panel today. The panel is today consisting of Britt Burnett, Deirdre Mitchell, Peter Blauhof, and Simon Henry. And in the back, we have Lieke Mecking, who is helping us out on managing questions, remarks, and facilitating the conference to a further extent whenever it's necessary. So again, allow me to give the word to you to do an introduction about yourself. I think that's the best way to get started, and then I will highlight the theme of today. Britt, would you like to kick off?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Britt Burnett. Lovely to be here today. You have received our bios all around, but just a couple of words to what I do and why I'm here. So I sit on the board of Unite2030, and that helps empower young people take actions linked to the SDG goals. I'm also an ambassador for Global Girl Project, which gives a voice to girls in the global south. And until recently, I was the COO of a clean energy access company operating in sub-Saharan Africa. And before that, of course, I worked for Shell and also sat on the board of Shell UK Oil Products. But besides my bio, as a person, I'm very much driven by purpose. So first and foremost, I aim to be a good mother and wife and friend, and to help those around me grow and develop, and then to champion gender equality and be a strong female role model. I also like to show care for the environment and contribute to the energy transition, and hopefully also laugh a lot. Now, as part of some of the topics that we see on boards today, I think there's probably three big topics that no one really foresaw in the last couple of years, which also means that it's become a lot more challenging to sit on a board than it has done in the past. I think the pandemic, of course, came out of nowhere. We've had the energy crisis that was triggered with the war in Ukraine. And then we've had all of the technology advancements. So with that in mind, it has never been more challenging to sit on a board, and the decisions that board members make are more critical and impactful than they've probably ever been before. And for that reason, I also see the energy transition as one of the biggest business opportunities in front of companies today. It is the time where you either make it or break it as a company. So that is my personal introduction. Back to you, Ennio.
Well, thank you, Britt. You definitely set the tone already. That's good, and appreciate it. Deirdre, can I give the word to you?
Yes, thank you. Morning, everyone, or wherever you are in the world. Lovely to be on the panel and appreciate the invitation. So thank you, Ennio. So in terms of me, I have been in and around the oil and gas and energy industry, I think forever, I would say. And for the last 8 years, I've been the CEO of Offshore Energies UK. So my focus is very much on a UK perspective. And the role was all about championing the industry sector in the UK as it went through, as Britt alluded to. We went through 2 downturns, COVID, and of course, progressing the energy transition at a time of great geopolitical turbulence that required the industry to work together with government to get the balance very much between security of energy supply and the energy transition, delivering on energy transition commitments. So Personally, I've held a number of non-exec roles over the years, and my current roles are with Scottish Water. And for those of you in the UK, there's a lot happening in relation to water. That's an English issue at the moment, I would argue. And I'm also on the board of Opportunity North East, which is all about economic regeneration for the northeast of Scotland as it goes through the transition from oil and gas into the other energies. So absolutely agree with Britt in terms of, I think, NEDs have a key role in setting the strategy and expectations in terms of delivering the energy transition. I think it's a really exciting time to be a non-exec, and it's a challenging time because with these opportunities come, real key accountabilities that we have to take on board as non-execs. And I think we're dealing with so much more complexity than we've had to deal with before. And people are terming this like a new world disorder. And I think it's really important that non-execs bring their diversity of skills and their experience. And I'm arguing that, we need network generalists as well as domain experts. And I think that's what you've got in the panel today. Anyway, so back to you.
Well, thank you again for that. It's good to already get your early perspective on the discussion that we're going to have later today. Peter, may I pass it to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Enyo, and great to be here in this forum. I see that the number of active attendees still is increasing, which is a good message. Peter Blauhoff, 34 years in Shell and been active in the energy industry ever since I left university. I'm a non-executive director now, but that gradually started during my Shell career, where I was the Shell representative on a number of boards. But when I stopped working for Shell, I'm not calling it retired because it doesn't feel like retirement. When I stopped working for Shell, I wanted to contribute to companies that needed, let's say, my expertise. And since then, I've built up a portfolio of non-executive directorships, which you find in my bio, which covers engineering, consultancy, and also big-scale manufacturing, both in one-tier and two-tier boards. That's probably an issue we might discuss also later, what the difference is, and where they not conflict, but where there are issues at the interface between the two. As Britt said, I think the energy transition is for most boards where I'm in, and both in the let's say the heavy industry, but also in the startups, a huge challenge. For some of the companies, a potential threat. For other companies, like in particular startups, an opportunity to grasp the opportunities that come along with the energy transition, and that all embedded in a rather fluid political environment, as we all know from the last years, in particular in Europe. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and in particular the questions from the audience. And with that, I'll give you back to Enyo.
Thank you, Peter. That's very helpful. Also mentioning the fact that we are open to the audience for questions and remarks that we will handle as good as we can. Simon, if I may.
And yeah, many thanks, and good morning to everybody wherever you may be. Simon Henry, 35 years in Shell. Left 6 years ago. The final 8 years were as CFO, a job I enjoyed a great deal, but gave a great transition into post-Shell life in terms of non-executive directorships, where I've become a bit of a serial non-exec. I've now sat on 6 boards, including Shell, but I've stood down from more than I now sit on. But I've worked in finance, banking, in mining, in energy and defence, and sat on public sector board and also on board of PetroChina at one point. So reasonably broad experience. I've found the non-exec roles very rewarding post-Shell. I've learned a great deal being in different organisations. And it's amazing just how much value there has been in the Shell experience, taking it elsewhere, and how many of the problems and challenges are actually quite familiar. I think, just to reflect, non-execs don't actually do much really. Strategy and purpose, We look at performance and risk management around that. We appoint the executives, reward them, and quite often coach and mentor them, which has been one of the more rewarding parts of the role. And we look after governance. I think that there are some really interesting challenges, some good points already made by colleagues about the change in the nature of the non-exec contribution, the increased level of professionalism and diligence, and actually the associated liability that goes with it if you get things wrong. And that has led to lifting of the requirements and the level of competence that's required, some specialist expertise around the board table, and I think better overall governance. And within that, diversity has made a big difference, and that's diversity of thought, opinion, background, experience, as well as gender, ethnic, minority, and the good boards have been ones that really make use of that diversity and not just have it on the board. One particular issue I'd like, hopefully we can follow up today, is the risk management aspect. I think that's something that I've seen in different stages of maturity wherever I've been, and in particular use of risk appetite to force the right conversation at the boards about what is our appetite for tolerance of risk, and particularly around energy transition. I think any board or any company that doesn't have at least one element of the energy transition, like the climate change, on their risk register, the opportunities and threats that are embedded in there, and doesn't think about it not just on Friday afternoons, but embedded within the strategy and all of the points I discussed. Any company that does not have that within their board agenda is probably going to have a problem one way or another. So it's very much on the risk register in all of the companies in which I've operated, even the banking sector, interestingly. And I'd like to hear a bit more about that today. Thanks, Ennio. Back to you.
Well, thank you, Simon. Again, the risk management topic is also an important one. I think the landscape for non-executive directors have dramatically changed over the last 5-6 years. I myself am a non-executive on a variety of charities. I like charities because I like to give my professional experience to charity and sweat equity, if you like. I'm also have been, and to some extent still am, an advisor for the energy transition to parliamentarian groups in the Netherlands. It's always interesting to see the lack of knowledge that policymakers sometimes have, and decisions that are often made on not extremely well thought through scientific reasons. So I try to put some critiquing on that thinking. Not always welcomed, but yeah, that's something that I feel I have to do. Currently, by the way, I am the UMS Group COO, and I'm also on the board. I'm also on the non-executive board, so I kind of have two heads, also referring to the two-tier type of boards that you got in companies from time to time, and the interesting mix that it sometimes gives, or conflict of interest even sometimes when you are a non-executive and an executive at the same time. So non-executive directors today, more than ever, like I said, play a critical role in overseeing corporate governance and risk management. And today's rapidly evolving business landscape, NEDs face a myriad of risk, which are related to the energy transition, as we mentioned, company resilience, because resilience is really something that probably NEDs or non-executive directors should be focused on more than everyone else, because there is a little bit more perspective to consider risks to resilience. And by the way, I have been interviewing at least 14 CEOs of major companies, and I was astounded by the fact that their perspective, or their awareness, if you like, about resilience and the risk that companies are currently occurring compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, is very, very, very low. And I hope that here today, from our non-executive perspective, there may be some seeds planted in people's minds to consider that as well. So let me go. While the theme has been set, let me just ask you an opening question, which is about the. It's a general question, actually. It's more being a non-executive director. Do you feel that there is an increased weight on your shoulders today compared to because I made that statement, but I would love to hear that from you. If you consider there is more weight on your shoulders today, more responsibility, even more risk for you personally compared to what it was like, let's say, 5 years ago. Whoever wants to go first.
Let me start, Ennio. I've lived through this gradual increase in let's say requirements for higher professionalism of non-executive directors. In the past, you had non-executive directors or board members that had, let's say, a handful or 10, maybe to 15 board positions. I think right now that's almost to be excluded, because it has really become a tough job in many cases. I think, as Simon hinted at, the legal requirement and the fiduciary duties have been tightened up, and also at least in the Netherlands and in Europe, there are quite a few lawsuits against non-executive directors, which really make the exposure that we already had by law really, visible, and you really see that society is asking much more from the non-executive directors. So having had experience over, let's say, two or 2.5 decades in boards, it gradually evolves from, let's say, I won't call it a red ribbon type of position to something that's now can sometimes be a full-time job. In particular, if the famous shit hits the famous fan, you need to be there to support the executive management. That's at least my experience.
Deirdre, you were.
Let me build on that. Completely agree with what Peter said and what Simon was saying earlier. I think we have seen a shift. I think it's an appropriate shift. I think we've seen ourselves moving from having to adhere to principles to, and I think it was Peter made the point, the reputational aspect of what companies are now required to do is really is there, and I think has been key to that shift. I mean, I think it's something that we should all, I don't think you ever should sign up to a NED unless you can commit the time and you understand the principles and you understand your duties. And I always remember when I was on my previous board, I was always taken when inviting somebody to become a board member with the ones who would go and check to see if they had the time to make the commitments. And whereas the ones who would just say, yeah, we'll sign up, no problem, you always made yourself think, okay. So we have seen a shift, and I think it's the right shift. And I think, the reputational aspect and the pressures that society is now putting on boards is the right one, that shareholders are putting on boards is the right one. It's not just about your consumers. We've got so many more stakeholders to deal with. And I think that has helped to contribute to this shift. And I think it's the right way to go. You shouldn't be signing up to a NED just to get something on your CV, would be the way I would summarize it.
Yeah, so do you feel there is more pressure now, more responsibility, more sleepless nights between brackets than there have been in the past?
Yeah, I think so, because again, I think what we're dealing with is more complicated and the stakes are higher. That's what it feels like. There'll be others around the group who say, no, actually, our experience is the stakes aren't higher. There's just the perception is different. I don't know if Simon or Peter probably have more perspective on that.
Simon?
I think the reputation issue is fundamental because as non-execs, our reputation personally as well as collectively is our biggest asset. And I've had, I don't know whether it's been the pleasure or the challenge of 4 of the boards I've sat on out of 6 have been through what I call crisis periods. So Rio Tinto, Harbour, Shell, and Lloyd's have all had really big challenges where executives, but also non-executives, have been in the public domain as to where were you, why didn't you do something to prevent this crisis happening, and from the way that you've reacted, have you done the right thing? And I've seen it reputationally affect both executives and non-execs such that they almost become unemployable thereafter. There is real litigation risk, criminal litigation in the United States, and increasingly in the UK, legal liability. So it's good that boards are seeing increased specialisation, particularly in the ESG area, our social license, environmental impact. And that's not just because of the industries I work in. I think that's broader. I think specialists in governance too. What that has actually done, there is a downside there, is maybe reduce the generalist type of board director and sort of, believe it or not, less focus on the economic performance of the company. I think now there's a much broader focus on the non-economic performance, which probably is a good thing. But how it actually plays out is very dependent on the character of the chair and the nature of the board and the nature of the industry, and does need to be balanced, I think. So I think overall it's a good point. And just back on the D&I aspect, the UK, firstly, it has a unitary board structure, so all directors bear the same responsibility and liability. There's no individual sense of liability, and therefore boards need to be inclusive. If you're not an expert in the environment, you do at least need to understand the risk. But also for the individuals coming in, it's enabled us to dip into broader pools, and the UK has almost met quite quickly the 40% requirement for women on board. It's struggling to make the ethnic minority targets of 25%, but in general, that's been a big shift in the nature of the discussion in the boards, more so than I think the liability that we carry versus 5 years ago. I think the actual response has changed things more for the better.
Yeah. Peter, do you feel you want to add to this?
No, not particularly, but I fully support what Simon said. I think also over time, apart from let's say boards getting more and more professional, I think one of the drivers has been that the focus has also gone from shareholder management to more stakeholder management in the broadest sense. It's not only customers, but for instance also staff. How do you recruit? And that's where reputation, of course, is key. If you have a bad reputation, then you lose out on those fronts. So I think the professionalism was to some extent, and that's not discussed to what extent, but to some extent also triggered by more focus on shareholders than only stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a change over time. Britt?
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to build on from what Simon was saying. So you were talking about diversity of the boards, and I think we both talk about diversity in terms of gender, but you were also mentioning on ethnic minorities. And it is good to see that on exchange listed companies, both in the UK and Denmark, where I'm sitting, we're getting closer to 40% of the boards actually listed companies representing females on that, but we need to go broader. But the other thing on competencies, right? The competencies of the board directors are also super critical. So we were mentioning sustainability and ESG, for example. We have a responsibility as board directors to be educated on a diverse portfolio of topics. And certainly ESG is one of them. And the other one is technology, because both of these things play such a big critical role. And it is key for the success of the board to ensure that there are some diversity of skill set and competencies within it as well.
Yeah, I have. I just see. I agree that I would not do it, but this one is too good to leave it out. In relation to what we are discussing, the question comes from Martijn Hoijmaier, and basically he says there is more legislation underway in the EU, CSDD, corporate sustainability due diligence, which places more requirements and demands on proactively monitoring the entire value chain. So the question is then, how do you manage to monitor all these risks? And are you confident that you have line of sight to all the potential risks? Because that basically aligns with another question that I would have asked as well. Could we, Simon?
And maybe I should comment on this. I've sat as an audit committee chair in 3 of the organisations that I've been on the board of, and obviously dealt with it in Shell. And UK corporate governance requires the audit committee to oversee exactly the answer to the question. The fact that there is a risk management framework in place, that it has processes in place to monitor both performance but also provide assurance back to the board. There is no way that a non-executive director, or actually, to be honest, even an exec director, can really know in detail what is happening across a large, complex organisation. Think about Shell. But the important thing is to analyse, understand and identify the risk properly. Assure yourself that where appropriate, there is a monitoring of performance within a risk appetite, going back to the risk appetite, and that there is an exception process for reporting as the performance moves outside a tolerance that is acceptable. And most importantly, from an audit committee perspective, and also on that personal liability for directors, to have assurance processes in place. And there is something known as, for the geeks, but the 3-line of defence assurance model, where the business executives provide the first line of assurance. They are to be of high integrity and high competence, obviously. Specialist subject matter experts provide a second level of expertise, both in terms of defining standards, but also doing specialist coaching, support and assurance activities. And then a third line of defence being internal audit. The audit committee needs to be sure that that framework is in place, that it is working, and receive assurance from those assurance providers. That's the only way, by depending on others, but a structured framework, that you can stay close to what is happening and maybe spot the risks that turn into crises before they get there. I think that governance process is good. You don't always see it when you're in an organisation, and it doesn't always work perfectly. But it is something that, if it doesn't work, creates exposure not just for the board but for the company itself.
Yeah, I find that. Deirdre, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, the way Simon's articulated, absolutely spot on. I think where I would now take that is, so you've got that framework and you've got that focus and that governance and expectation. I think to enhance it is the opportunity is how you work with your supply chain. So I know Martin talks about the value chain. I would kind of break that down and say the better as an organization and as a board you can encourage the company to be working with the supply chain and to be understanding the market and the risks through the supply chain. Because as Simon said, you're putting everybody to account within the company, and the way the people within the company can then kind of reinforce their understanding is by working collaboratively with the supply chain. I think that is another add to what Simon has so well articulated.
Yeah, so for me, the supply chain is also related to the resilience check question, right? But it's really what you're just sharing, all. It's quite overwhelming. I mean, we can say, okay, we have a governance model in place, and then of course process is very important because process allows us to manage content, but we don't know what we don't know, right? So so there are two perspectives from what I try to understand here. One is the internal perspective, which is as a person, to what extent does the process provide you sufficient safety for staying away from even criminal charges? So, for example, if you take in Italy, law is very rigid. The public prosecutor is very rigid. Even when there is a smell of something that's wrong, you already get indicted. And so that reduces the appetite for many people to join on those boards, unless the financial reward is very high. And I think, personally, I feel that's the wrong incentive to join boards. But Britt, you were wanting to add to this?
Well, yeah, I think as a board director, you have to foster a healthy amount of paranoia, and a mix between curiosity and paranoia. And you have to go to town on the difficult questions, because if you don't, there might be, of course, various implications for the company itself. And I think I don't know how many on this call watched the BBC's panorama of the tea plantations in Kenya earlier this year, right? But we have a UK tea company that is producing tea in Kenya, supplying all of the big supermarkets, Tesco's and Sainsbury's, and the panorama is about the sexual exploitation of the women working in the fields, and it is the board's obligations to make sure that ethical business practices are all the way through the entire value chain, and that is inconvenient and it is tough. But it is the board's ethical obligation to make sure that the business practices are being upheld according to the company's standards.
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe come back indirectly to Britt's comment a few minutes ago, and that's on the board composition. That's how we started. Of course, gender is very important and very much in focus today. The other question, which was also in the chat, is it is an illusion that a board, however great, can cover all the aspects of complex companies. So let's exclude that. And I've not lived through boards where that is the case. So you need to have a certain view, and I think the sound paranoia that just was mentioned is maybe a good one. You need to understand in what area the company is operating and what the risks are, to ask the right questions. And then, indeed, as Simon said, there are a number of safety nets that you need to have in the whole structure to ensure that if one fails, that another one catches the risks, and that the appropriate measures are being taken. One point that was raised, I think, by Deirdre is what I found very important, and that also links to one of the questions that is on the web, is that in the board you need to have sufficient flexibility and time available to act in case of crisis, because even if a risk materializes, it means an extra burden on the board. If you have a board of people that are also operating at the sea level, then it's not very likely that anyone can make time available to step in. So I have personally good experience where boards have one or two people that you might call them liberos or so, that can make time available when needed. And I've personal experience. You've seen my bio in a company where the famous shit hit the famous fan, and from let's say a one day a week job, it ended up in a full-time job during the Corona crisis. So also in board composition, you need to look at who can step in if a crisis really hits the company.
Yeah. So if you say the crisis, when or if the crisis hits the company, what about prevention? Because what you see a lot is that many of the major crises that hit companies or even scandals, have not been prevented, despite the fact that there are very capable people in executive committees and teams and in boards. How would you explain that?
Well, I think many companies have in what in Exxon speak is called below ground risks and not above ground risk, which includes, for instance, pandemics, political movements, etc. So a lot is of the risk management I've seen in some of the companies is managed at the own processes, but not at the outside world, and that's where very often, the problems start. As you've seen in my bio, I was in the board of Tata Steel Netherlands, and the problems that Tata Steel Netherlands has now have indirectly to do with what decisions they took, let's say a decade or 2 decades ago. But it was triggered by external societal movements, and if that's not on your radar screen for companies like a Tata Steel, you have a problem, and that's where, let's say, common sense or sound paranoia, as it was called, is helpful to ensure that you at least identify the risks.
Yeah. I experience sound paranoia as a paradox, but let's Simon, you wanted to add to that, right?
Yeah, I think there are two sources of risk which are generic to most companies, most boards. The internal risks, when your own control framework breaks down, have root causes, and one of the root causes, if not the root cause, is always behavior, and it's bad behaviors that are enabled by a cultural environment, and that cultural environment is typically enabled by leadership. This is one of the really difficult things for boards to assess and monitor. You have to do it through sort of hard process like colleague surveys, and just go and talk to people. But it is still difficult to catch, and you need to be aware of what could go wrong, have the indicators in place quickly, and be prepared to act quickly. And I've look back and say, well, we should have fired certain people earlier rather than later to avoid crises happening. But that's one ultimate source of risk, is the internal. The other is the external. There are things you can't do anything about. The pandemic clearly was external, but there are others that you do have a lot of agency over. Energy transition is one of them, and I see there are quite a few interesting questions. In fact, this is pretty tough exam questions out there on the side of the screen. But energy transition is not something we don't expect. There are multiple stakeholders out there. There are real challenges here. The point just made about supply chain and fundamental in the energy transition. As I'm speaking as a miner now, not energy, if the mining supply chain doesn't work, the energy transition isn't going to happen. You mentioned, Ennio, the political side, that's amazing how little knowledge and awareness politicians act on, particularly the decisions they make. You work in a country which is a damn sight better aware of and higher knowledge than the one that Deirdre and I work in. I'll defer to her in terms of how competent the UK government is, but it won't be a very long conversation. So indeed, you're dealing with stakeholders of very different levels of awareness, understanding, and then some of them make big decisions that impact on companies. So it's incumbent on directors, on non-execs, in fact, really to bring that external focus and connections and engagements in to the boardroom and get a good assessment of that risk. And that, I keep going back to that's where it helps to have a really diverse group. I've got board colleagues who ask questions, and I think, well, that's a bit strange. Then I think, well, that's a really good question, and I would never have thought of that because it's just not my background. And the board can be really powerful here because execs live in their own bubble. It's natural, and they're full-timers, and they don't necessarily get the time to engage in discussions like this, for example.
Yeah, there is a bit of. Oh, I hear myself in a loop. There's a bit of a strange loop there. If you talk about behavioral change or cultural change in a company, and it should start with leadership. But then, if the leadership is in a let's say in a close relationship, even with the board, then there is a risk of a circular loop that doesn't really bring a fresh perspective into that. Would you think that that's one of the reasons why some of the companies, without doing names or so, but why some of the companies fail dramatically to have a very clean and clear or even crisp board perspective to also guide executive management in their decision making?
I just follow on the question. There are some executives I've seen and worked with, including in Shell, that manage the board. They choreograph board meetings, and they, not Shell now, by the way, this is 20 years ago, choreograph meetings, and they restrict access of board members to the company. That's not the case now. And I do think good boards, good chairs, enable the right kind of discussion. But you still got to recognise that executives and non-executives are different. Might be a unitary board; they've both got the same liabilities, but their perspectives are different. And it's really incumbent. A non-exec role is not built well. It's the cycle is around board meetings, but the actual work is often done outside board meetings through, for example, the subcommittees, or just on the phone or Teams as it is today.
Yes.
Or on visiting assets. If you don't do that, then you lose that sense of connection and engagement of what's really happening. What I've found is amazing how sort of and motivated and happy to talk to board members most people are. It's only the execs and maybe the mid-level that are see it as a possible threat. If you go and talk to people on the front line, you get a great discussion.
That's absolutely true. Britt, you were mentioning something. You were.
Yeah. No, I had a thought building on Simon's point about there are certainly external factors that you can't foresee, and definitely the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, Credit Suisse. I mean, I think lots of these risks just weren't on people's risk registers, right? So they came out of nowhere. However, then the board, and that probably also links a little bit to Robert's question, it is the board's influence to also help the organization pivot, because these factors may force the change of the business model, right? And if I look at Unite2030, which is a charity that was very much based face-to-face during the pandemic, they had to create a completely new business model where they served their demographic online. And I think the same thing, bringing it back to maybe the energy transition, the shortage or the reliance on Russian gas has also meant that many companies have had to diversify their energy sources and reinvest. And I think this is the bit that is super critical. I mean, whilst 2022 was a very, very challenging year for many companies, there are also many companies that had their ultimate profits, right? And, Shell was one of them, Siemens was another one, Maersk was another one, right? So it is also the obligation of some of these companies that have had record profits to reinvest in the energy transition, in sustainable energy sources and the clean tech space, which is also why I'm, and paranoid optimist when it comes to what lies ahead in that space.
But if you say, companies have to invest their extra gains and profits. If I reiterate, wouldn't that make you a little bit of an activist if you would push that as a board member, non-executive board member?
Yeah, but I think so. A couple of reflections there. As a board member, it is your responsibility to hold the company's best interests in mind, right? So that is your ultimate goal. What you're forced to do is think about what is best for the company long term, and in order to be competitive in the long term, then I would argue that you would need to take a stance on that within the realm of what's within the realm of where the company operates.
Yeah, I think that's philosophically very interesting, because the long-term interest of the company, sometimes has conflicts with stakeholders, and and maybe not necessarily. Well, not if you say long-term interest of the company, that's basically a shareholder value, whereas some may consider shareholder value the environment and and all kinds of qualitative elements as valuable as well. So I think that's a very difficult one, and probably this session here doesn't allow sufficient time to go into that too deeply. But Peter, I saw that you were also eager to jump on.
I fully agree with what Britt just said. But let's be fair. In some respects, the long-term future of the company starts today. If you're not able to attract the right people into your company today, and let's be fair, the current generation is much more focused at climate change, energy transition, etc. So if your company has a bad reputation, to put it very black and white, then it becomes increasingly difficult to get the right people into the company. I'd like to latch on one question, one remark to Simon's point on the management, if you allow me, Enyo. And that is that as a board director, I've always had the attitude not to only rely on the information that comes to me through the executive board. I've always had links into the organization, not by stealth, but I informed the executive management that I was going to have certain discussions, and that has been extremely helpful to get a more balanced view, because consciously or unconsciously, a lot of the information from the executives to the board is being filtered. Part of it with good reason, but not always.
So anyway, can I jump in and just go back?
Sure.
Can I just take us back before? I know you want to move on from the role of board, but I do think, and I want to come in behind what Britt and Peter were saying, I do think it's about getting the balance of not taking short-term decisions and short-term dividends and putting the onus on future generations. I think board has a responsibility, yes, to the value, as you said, of the value is bigger than just money today, I think. And I think boards need to take that on board and recognise they've also got a societal relevance in a way that perhaps they never considered before. And their decisions are not short term. And I think it's really important that that's the shift that we see companies making today. And just, that's where the short-termism approach, and I think Simon was alluding to it in terms of some government decisions, short-termism at whether it's government level or board level absolutely can drive the wrong outcomes and leave us, as others around the room have said, with the kind of mess that we're seeing today. And I think that's where non-execs can make a real difference and hold the line, shall we say.
Yeah, but if you say so, and I cannot. I try to disagree with you, but I can't. Would that, again, the question that I asked Britt, would that make you a bit more activistic as a non-executive?
No, it doesn't make you active. it makes you do the job that you're supposed to be doing as a non-exec. I don't think that takes you off into the realms of extremes. I think it just makes you do what you are supposed to be doing.
Yeah, but what you're supposed to be doing today is different than it was 5-6 years ago, right? So
well, I would argue that actually what we're doing today is living the principles. So in the UK, we've got Nolan principles as an example. And okay, those have been built on in terms of legal requirements, but they're very clear that that is the role of a board member, is to take the company, the sustainability of the company, but in a bigger context.
Yeah, well, okay. Before I go to Simon, just one on this. If you say the principles haven't changed, if I reiterate, paraphrasing what you just said, then I would argue that there is more fabric around the principles than there was, I say 5-6 years, but can also be 10 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I also think societal expectations have changed around the delivery of those. So I think you're right. I think we have seen a shift, but actually, when you look back, I think actually the fundamentals haven't really changed.
Right. Okay, Simon.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's an obligation on us to be more vocal, not necessarily activist. I draw the line between stunts and genuine stakeholder engagement about, for example, with governments, outlining the consequences of bad policy or short-termism, or a government that runs on announceables, i.e. sound bites, rather than underlying policy. And just back on the energy transition, there's a couple of questions around the concept of net zero target and how many companies, organisations, or even countries. While almost everybody has a net zero target, and almost all of them comply with Paris, whatever that actually means. But by 2030, most people are saying 50% lower, and by 2050, net zero. And very few organisations have an underlying plan, resourced, and milestones and performance management to deliver it. That is true not just of companies, but society at large. Clearly, I think that I'd be interested to explore a bit further some of the questions as to so what should boards do about it, particularly public boards. We're probably the only part of that stakeholder environment that is going to be held accountable for statements we make, because governments aren't. The reason they're short term in the West is because of the political cycle is short. It's about 48 hours in the UK. In most countries, it's measured in years, but not enough years for sound policy to persist. But companies will still be around in 10 years' time, 5-10 years' time, sometimes even the same executive. So we're going to be held accountable in a way that others aren't. And there's a reference to, for example, TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. There are growing requirements around transparency and disclosure on climate change specifically, but more generally as well. And the ISSB and the EU in particular bringing in what will become mandatory requirements for broad and non-financial reporting, which the board will own, which is going to be part of good governance, and which actually will ultimately, I think, hold companies responsible for doing the right thing and doing it well. But we're only a very small part of the whole of the ecosystem. Yes, okay, Shell could invest another 5 billion. Yeah, so where's the other 3 trillion minus 5 billion going to come from that needs to be invested in the energy transition every year? And who's accountable for that? And where's that money going to come from? So I think many of us have got great networks, a prominent position in society. Maybe we can make a difference.
Yes, I think that you just opened up Pandora's box to the super macro perspective, but I just would like to go back to the last part of the question that Carlijn Buys asked, which is about the level playing field between non-listed companies and listed companies, because I think that's a very valid point. I notice that almost on a daily basis in my my work. I'm not sure about you. Well, Simon, you got your mic still open. You want to?
That's why companies are delisting, fundamentally, and there is a significant amount of capital. And if you look at what's happening in the UK, I think Deirdre mentioned it on water at the moment. Thames Water is largely owned by a relatively small number of private equity type organisations. So it's a definite shift in scrutiny, and public companies are, as I mentioned, I think they're the sharp end of accountability, and perhaps the only part of the system that is being held accountable in a very public way. And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think, first of all, you'll see companies move from Europe to US listings because the scrutiny is less in the US, happening on a regular basis at the moment. And you'll see companies taking themselves private again. And that could include companies I'm involved with. So it's not a remote prospect for exactly these reasons. It's not because the companies are not responsible or good operators. It's because the combination of expectation and accountabilities and investors' willingness to price accordingly is just it's a set of equations with no obvious solution.
Yeah. Peter, you were about to say something on this as well. Sorry, Peter, you were about to say something on this as well.
I fully agree with Simon, but I think it's only a matter of time that listed and delisted companies will be subject to the same scrutiny. It can be, in some cases, it can be relatively short, and in other cases, it can maybe be a decade. So it's a matter of time. This level playing field is, of course, the basis of the way we do business in this world. But it's quite clear that listed companies have an early exposure.
Yeah. So who would be leveling the playing field then?
I think society will once they see that listed companies more and more comply with the zero net targets, and other companies lag, they will become the next ones in focus. That's my hypothesis, which, from my personal experience, seems not unreal, to put it that way.
I have to comment, sorry, and I think society doesn't understand capitalism, let alone the difference between public and private companies, equity companies. And I think society is ahead of itself relative to many governments.
Yeah.
Governments, don't you look at the things that are being said at the moment? There are some fundamental issues about the need for massive investment, and where is that investment going to come from if it's ever going to earn a return, other than the public sector, which doesn't have the money.
Well, I don't think that only society at large doesn't understand capitalism. I'm now starting to think that also the decision makers in the governmental domains don't understand that either. And that's there's a demographic and generational reason for that, I suppose. But Britt, you were also mentioning something in relation to Carlijn's question. You want to elaborate on that?
I think society in large is actually consumers, and consumers today are voting with their purchasing power, and that's why companies and consumers kind of go hand in hand. And with regards to Carlijn's question in terms of how do you stay on top of all of these topics, whether it's AI, climate, supply chain, geopolitical, etc. You can't, right? You really just can't. But it is the board's responsibility to make sure that we get subject matter expertise added into the board discussion. So, you review maybe the geopolitical landscape surrounding your value chain, at least on an annual basis. But you need to get your subject matter experts in. The same thing with technology and AI. I would argue that there probably are quite a lot of people sitting on boards that just have a little bit more seniority that may not have that subject matter expertise, but they absolutely have to, right? So you need to bring in that expertise to the boardroom and really have a discussion about how does this impact our business and our operations and our short and long-term future.
Yes. That's actually correct. So if we, I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that I agree with it. Not that I'm not in the position to say whether you're correct or not. But but if we basically limit, the domain in which we are talking a little bit more, because there's this in this conversation. We tend to take on all the global challenges from a broad perspective, and if we limit it a little bit more to the non-executive director's position in regard to, for example, assessing the potential risk and challenges that the energy transition poses to organizations in the utilities industries, for example, if you limit that to the industry, how do you assess the risk, the potential risk of the energy transition to specifically the energy industry, but feel free to talk about any other industry as well. Let's say, Peter?
Yeah, of course, that comes to quite some, as a board, to quite some extent back to the let's say the total experience of the board to have an idea of where the relevant company is exposed, and it's back to Simon's expose on risk management. I think that's where it boils down to, and as I said before, it's impossible to cover all elements in detail in the expertise of the board members, because then you get very large boards which become ineffective in itself. But you need to know where to get help, and understand how society develops and how the requirements of society change over time, and then get the help in either from internal resources or external resources, and that's where you need to keep the executive sharp. They have very often blind spots for one or two of these issues where diverse board really can help to open up the discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the reason why I asked that question is because I have done myself a couple of energy transition readiness assessments in which there was never an NED involved, and it's interesting to see that companies have different roadmaps to the objective, right? So if the objective is by 2035 or by 2050 to have reached, for example, net zero to the best that they can be, then the assessment is to understand how the road would look like, and the assessment would basically say, are you on the right track or are you down from the right track? And if you are down from the right track, how much does it take in order to correct you to get you back on track? Because what I found is that a lot of executive management is very stubborn, not to say complacent from time to time, to think, or comfortable that they think that they're on the right track and everything will work out fine, and we're doing what we have to do, and paying lip services to questions that are asked from community and also from non-executives. So I'm really worried there, because I've seen it unfolding in many other large companies that there is no energy transition readiness. So I think the board has a more pronounced role there than maybe initially thought they would have. Simon?
Yeah, thanks. I think this varies a bit about how parochial the actual executive management are. If they're open-minded, it can help. I'm going to make a plug for a Shell sort of centre of expertise, scenarios and planning into the future. The risk assessment is fundamentally, from a board's perspective, about the business model. That's where you should be starting, and it's not just the business model today. It's how will that evolve, starting ultimately with the customer, some of which is consumer, some of which is B2B, so other businesses, etc. And the company I currently work with has what they term a future back approach to strategy and risk assessment, which says 10, 15 years out, what are possible scenarios in terms of how the products in which we are currently involved will be consumed, or what the customer will want, how that might change, and working backwards from 10 years out from a couple of scenarios as to where are the risks in terms of the choices we make today. So I think it's understanding from the customer backwards and the future backwards what could change and how resilient is the current business model to those changes, meaning you can't put all your eggs in one basket, but you also can't bet on all horses, to mix my metaphors. It's the board's responsibility is to create that, or either create or ensure that that discussion is being had with appropriate external expertise. It's very few companies are fortunate enough to have that expertise internally. Shell pretty much did, but it's almost unique in that, I would say. And that thinking brings you backwards into what is it that I need to think about today to mitigate short-term risks, to handle medium-term risks, and think about long-term. Is there a threat, an existential threat to my business model? And obviously for oil and gas companies producing, there is an existential threat long-term. There is a short-term massive opportunity because prices are going to be high and volatile, and in those environments you make money. But what's the right way in the medium term to turn that resource and that's available to you into a sustainable, long-term and resilient future? That's the conversation that the boards not only could have, but they really should be having now. I don't know how many boards do have that, but it's actually also one of the more interesting parts of being a member of the board, to see that in different industries and from different perspectives.
Do you agree?
Yeah, so just I like that future back approach. I think that could be really quite powerful. But just go back to what you were saying, Ennio, about when you've done the kind of assessments of companies and whether they're on track or not, and just looking at Jan Heim's question as well about strategy and purpose. I think part of also the board's role is when execs with the board have set the strategy, that you give them confidence when they hit a roadblock. So I've been party to a time when I saw the company in relation to energy transition hitting a roadblock and saying, that's too difficult, we can't get around it, therefore our targets have to take that into context. And the board saying, actually, no, we're still committed to that. You have to find a way around that roadblock, and we will give you the confidence. We have your back in terms of you doing that, and that's how you drive innovation. I know that all sounds really high level, and I'm deliberately not being giving the specific example, but I do think as a general approach, the board has to have the courage to encourage the exec to keep going in that way. And that's how you get innovation, rather than just saying, that's too difficult, we're not going to make the target, let's adjust the target.
Right.
Maybe to add on that, and I'll name the company anyway, because you can easily reconstruct that from my diary. In Tata Steel Limited, we by the board, a workshop was triggered for senior management in Tata Steel on the effect of climate change and the challenges there. That's just to educate the layer below the executives on what was coming, in the hope to get a kind of groundswell for the zero net target strategy of Tata Steel. And I think that's a very useful way to be involved in the strategy, not by dictating as a board what the strategy should be, but educate the people on the challenges that you see as a board. We did that with external advisors from Cambridge University, and that was not every company can do that, but that's in general as a principle is a very effective way to I won't say steer, because in a two-tier board you're not allowed to steer, but to advise on how you would like to see the strategy to develop.
Right, Britt?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Deirdre said in terms of, and that also links to Jan Hein's question. I mean, the board is ultimately the custodians of the purpose and the strategy of the company. And I don't think anything has changed there, but it is our job to make sure that the long term is secured. What I really like what you said, Deirdre, is sometimes we gotta have the end in mind, right? So if the end goal is not to have any packaging solutions, then innovation happens, right? I mean, you look at the Carlsberg example of gluing the cans together instead of having the plastic rings around. And that's just a beautiful example. And I know the same is true in Maersk in terms of the journey for decarbonizing the shipping industry. So if you're bold about what the end goal looks like, you might not get there tomorrow or in 3 years' time, but you might come up with something that is really a viable business model for the longer term that's good for the business and also happens to be good for the environment.
Yeah. So how do you, because I think it's a very thin balance about how the NED could or can influence or impact the that direction. You know, Deirdre was quite stringent, but I know that it doesn't always work like that. In also depending on the culture where you are. So would there be like a general recipe that you would think of that could enforce, but not without too much force, not without dictating, and you know the right, let's say, the right lane to communicate, which would be cross-culturally valid. Do you think there is something like that, Simon?
Yeah, it's perhaps more specifically, and Peter's raised steel and Brit shipping as industries that do have decarbonisation plans. I suggest both of them rely on a very large supply of hydrogen. And at the moment, hydrogen, one, isn't economic, and two, certainly isn't available at scale to support either. So into ammonia for shipping, for example. And that's an externality. It's okay to have a roadmap. Yes, we can convert our ships or we can convert our blast furnaces. But if it's reliant on, again, literally trillions of dollars of somebody else investing, the board has a role, I think, in avoiding overcommitments where you're not in control. But also, you do have agency on the hydrogen supply chain. You do have some impact and influence, and that is something that, again, I think boards can work with executives to bring something the executives may not sort of bring themselves. Because again, in both cases, you're talking at least 10, 15-year time frame. And that is actually beyond the time horizon of your current executive team. So there is a danger that they make commitments. And the board does need to keep their focus on where we'd like to be 10, 15 years time and what we can actually do today. And adjust. So while I think the board needs to stick with strategic intent, the timing, scale, and maybe even the path to those outcomes can be dynamic over time. And part of what the board does is help very much the executive find a path that works. But some of the challenges facing us in the energy transition are not solvable by individual companies alone.
But there an important aspect of the of a diverse board into play, huh? Because they are linked to other companies usually, and of course, specifically speaking for steel, I use my oil and gas network to explore how hydrogen could become available. But let's not dive too much into this specific case. But that's the way I would expect non-executive directors to act in the various boards. It's this network that they bring apart from the competencies.
Indeed,
network
me
help.
too. Very much me too. I mean, that particular problem is almost certainly going to be solved in China, not in Europe.
Could well be.
With the capacity scale. So again, I mean, we've got 2 or 3 board members in Rio Tinto, for example, who have direct experience of China, and that is even much more so than the executive.
Yeah, Deirdre gave, let's say, a qualitative element in the equation of non-executive boards, really ensuring that the executives keep their eye on the ball and not basically not changing the objectives. Whereas you put some, if I can paraphrase that, some, let's say, decision-making realism into the mix as well. Simon, do you think that that's a right reflection on the discussion? Because the realism, because what you were saying about the focus of executives, not being distracted and not changing the target and the objective, is also to bring some realism in the equation, where maybe some things are just not technically not feasible. So maybe we still have to make sure that we don't overestimate or over establish our objectives. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I've used hydrogen as an example. Sometimes it's easier to use an example. Clearly, in the end, we need green hydrogen. The end game is green hydrogen. The amount of green hydrogen that is going to be available in the next 10 years is going to be fairly limited. So a roadmap that says in either steel or shipping, or some of the things I'm directly involved in, well, steel I am involved in, obviously, as an iron ore provider, will they'll require us to go through a brown hydrogen, a blue hydrogen, and a green hydrogen roadmap. There are zealots in the process, including within our organisations, but very much in the external stakeholder and some governments that say, no, you can never use blue hydrogen. For example, CCS, carbon capture storage, is merely a way of prolonging the use of fossil fuels. Well, yeah, it is, but without carbon or without CO2, should I say? And if you have ideology overriding a realistic path, so users of hydrogen need to be investing now. And that will need them to use brown and blue hydrogen, because there is no green hydrogen, because electrolyzers are just not available in a large enough scale. It's all tiny. It's test tube scale compared to the end game of the industrial scale that's going to be required. And the industrial scale requires renewables to be about 5 times the current capacity, which is going to happen, but not in a year or two. So that's where I think boards can bring realism, because not only to the executive, but to external stakeholders as well.
And anyway, I need to come back in on that as well, because I absolutely am completely aligned with where Simon's coming from. My articulation maybe wasn't very clear. I think boards' role is to get that balance in terms of what's realistic against what you've set yourself, and help. And what I was trying to say is the board's role is to help the exec navigate that path, give them confidence that when they get a roadblock, they can get round it in a certain way. And as Simon's using the hydrogen analogy, which is really good, because like you say, you want to use green hydrogen, but actually it's going to take a step process. And board's role is to help exec do those steps. So this isn't about ideology versus decision making at all. So I just thought I'd come back on that one anyway.
Okay, so sorry for teasing you on that one. Case de Bruin asked the question to you, Peter. Could you please elaborate on what you said earlier, that as an NED you can only advise and not steer?
Well, that has to do with in what type of board you are. If you're in a two-tier board, in principle, the decisions are taken by the executives, and you supervise as a supervisory board, and that's prevalent in let's say Northwest Europe. In the Anglo-American system, it's most of it is a one-tier board where you're jointly, as Simon said at the beginning, you're jointly accountable for the decisions. So that's what I meant here. So that's depending on what kind of legal structure you are. You either co-responsible, to put it that way, with the executives for the decision, or you, in the end, you're always responsible. Let me put it that way. But in a two-tier board, the executive decisions are taken by the executives, and you can approve them or not, and then you're not supposed to develop your own strategy as a two-tier board. It is the executives that develops that and that you approve them. So it was meant to. So my remark should be seen in that light of the two-tier board.
Yeah, thank you, and I hope this your answer answered the question of Kees de Bruin, who I thank for the question. So if we go to the other topic, which is resilience, which I mentioned, and by the way, resilience, energy transition, regulatory changes, AI, all those things cannot be seen independently. They're all integrated to some extent, but considering that there are also separate themes, I would like to zoom in a little bit for the last part of this conference and panel conversation or discussion about resilience. So from your perspective, what are the most critical risks to companies' resilience in the face of the changing market conditions and disruptions? And I'm thinking about, indeed, geopolitically, the energy transition, which we already discussed, but also information technology, artificial intelligence, etc. Just to set the dimensions of the question. Who would like to jump on that one? Brit, you're nodding yes. Can I hand it to you?
You absolutely can. I mean, I think first of all, in terms of resilience, right? We were talking about the decisions many boards have made around the war in Ukraine, and for many companies, taking the geopolitical lens, it was an easy enough decision to choose to pull out of Russia, which many companies did, including Shell. But the other geopolitical risk is, of course, China, right? We in the West have created a huge reliance on production and manufacturing in China. So what's going to be our stance if China takes on Taiwan? So that's definitely a huge geopolitical risk. So maybe before I move on, maybe there's a couple of my colleagues who wants to build on that.
Well, if I can add to that, because again, this is also a field that I'm seriously doing polling and research on with the team. The issue with resilience is that until, let's say, again, this famous 5-6 years ago, there was always a kind of a plan B, a backup plan, and there was sufficient supply of everything, and there was also, in terms of resilience thinking, there was a lot of complacency. The thing is that given the current volatility in the world, so you mentioned geopolitical as one, but there is also scarcity and resources, etc. And and the wars out there are not just because they don't like each other; it's always about resources at the end. You mentioned there is no plan B with many companies, and this is where I say, okay, you really have to dive into your supply chain. And the same way back in the 90s, companies were ensuring there was no child labor in their supply chain. You should do the similar process to identify and investigate where your vulnerabilities are in terms of supply. Because if you mention China, I use the China example a lot, and I say if China takes Taiwan, and nothing much will happen if we don't react. But if we react and we, let's say that China will shut down the chip manufacturing company, or even worse, if they would, bomb the factory. We won't have a supply of chips to the rest of the world, at least because that's 78% of the chip supply. We would be almost back to, no, I don't want to say Stone Age, I'm exaggerating, but we would be severely jeopardized and paralyzed by such a thing. And then the question is, can you be resilient enough to mitigate that? No, maybe not today, but is it something that companies should be thinking about? Yes, for sure. And how then, the logical mitigation approach would then be, we have to make sure that supply comes from a different place than 78% out of that country. Is that in line with what you were saying, Britt?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think 100%. It just changes, and it is back to the kind of the risk linked to the overarching value chain that we have. Yeah, so diversification of our supply chain, of our energy environment, and actually on the geopolitical side of things, I think there's also many companies that are looking at localization and versus the globalization, but actually the global approach is very good for diplomacy. It's good for peacekeeping because that reliance actually keep us in check, whilst it may not be so good for our CO2 footprint. So there's the pluses and minuses and things that just never particularly straightforward. But those are certainly the considerations that and discussions boards are having. What would we do if this happens? And should we diversify a little bit more?
Simon?
The diversification point is really important. I think resilience, again, you need to look different time frames. Short-term resilience is different to long-term. So short to medium term, your resilience is underpinned by strong balance sheet. I would say that, obviously. But being the lowest cost provider of whatever product or service you have, because the biggest risk is changing pricing environment, whether you control it or not, and running out of cash. So it's very much a finance going concern and viability, but that's a 1 to 3 year horizon. The medium and long term, the points on the supply chain, for example, I wouldn't want to harp on back to it, but provision of critical minerals, Europe, the US, both have either Critical Minerals Acts or the Inflation Reduction Act. Even the UK has a critical minerals strategy. Roughly 90% of the critical minerals on the list are 50% or higher control of the value chain by China. And that is at least as big a risk as the chips. I have to declare a personal interest there in risk terms. My daughter lives in Taiwan, in Taipei. So this is a clear and present interest or danger for me. And yes, it's something a lot of companies had to think very differently about, supply chain risk. And that is a fundamental risk over time. And what is the best way of creating resilience in the longer term? Well, it's about meeting customer requirements as they evolve, but it's also about diversification. You can't be on the most perfectly optimized value chain and supply chain without alternatives. So a little bit more resilience in the system requires maybe a bit more extra cost, more contingency, options, and that's something that current investors are not always happy with. But until there is a crisis, of course, at which point your competitors are the ones they're not happy with. The boards have to play, and Ray talked about balance previously. The board has to help the executive in bringing balance to that conversation. But we have, diversification, I think, is on most boards' risk register at the moment, and strategically is what people are thinking of, whether it's supply chain, whether it's the customer proposition that you're offering, or geopolitical risk.
Yeah, thank you for also answering the unasked question, because that was also a question on my list. Peter, you were saying?
The more I think about it, and it's not only today, is that supply chain risks and political risk become synonymous. And then Simon Simon gave a nice example of the rare earth materials that are mainly controlled, or to quite some extent controlled by China. The other aspect, talking about hydrogen, is that if you look at the hydrogen supply chain, we need enormous amounts of green power to get green hydrogen. And in the Middle East, they're planning projects for 40 gigawatts of renewable power for producing hydrogen to export to Western Europe, among others. And that's so the change in the supply chain that we will see in particular on energy and energy carriers, that we will see over the next decade will be enormous. Countries like Chile and Namibia and Northern Africa will come up in that sense. So that's part of that should be part of the resilience discussions in energy intensive companies.
Yes. So thank you, Peter. We are coming to the end of this session, and I think if we would have another 2 hours, we could easily fill that with no trouble at all. I just want to make sure that we also we have 2 remaining questions that I want to put out there. One is for Peter, if you can briefly answer that one, which is, at what point would a 2-tier board be of great value to a company?
Well, in some countries it's legally prescribed. For instance, in Germany, and in the Netherlands, it's now flexing up to also go for 1-tier boards. I think there's no general advice for that, but of course you need to obey the law. If it prescribes 2-tier, then it's 2-tier.
Right.
There's no specific preference. The type of board members may be different if you do go for a 2-tier than for a 1-tier board. That's the only point.
Yeah, I still think that maybe diversity is the common denominator that would be beneficial to both choices. A question from Veronique. Britt, what are your thoughts on localization instead of diversification?
It's a balance. It drives me crazy if you're manufacturing a car where parts come from China, Taiwan, India, and then assembled in Germany, right? So we need to be smart about it. But there are some things that makes more sense being manufactured in China and shipped to Europe. So let's look at it holistically and create greater awareness around the CO2 footprint and what is best and most sustainable overall.
Yeah. So, Simon, you were still adding some flavor to this.
Localization is a great idea. We could not make solar panels outside China because they have the technology and they have the materials. So, great idea, can't be done. That's back to the realism. Our challenge is to get ahead of China on a few other technologies, and then there's a mutual interest between us, which reduces some of the geopolitical risks as well.
Yeah, that's again very much a pinch of realism into this conversation, which is very helpful. I think if I would summarize that that NED should maintain a proactive approach, continue reviewing and reassessing risks, engaging with stakeholders, and ensuring effective risk management and strategies are in place. I think did I then summarize the basically a conclusion here, or also saying that NED should navigate the complexities of the evolving business landscape, if you want, and position the organizations for prevention of failure or getting successful in the face of these key risks. Is that something that would summarize this conversation? What do you think? Good. Well, in that case, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Shell Alumni Network and on behalf of the audience and and the community that's going to review this session afterwards. Thank you so much for joining and having you, Britt Burnett, Deirdre Mitchie, Peter Blauhoff, and Simon Henry. Again, have a great day and thank you so much. Bye-bye.